So yes, if after this panel you have more questions and you have answers, please reach out to me and we'll see if we can connect you up with some of our committee members or some of the panelists to get your questions answered. So this will be, we don't have to go in order or anything. This is just a chat type setup. And I'll start off with some questions, and whoever feels inspired will toss the answers around. So how do I know if I need to do anything with the FDA to implement my idea? A lot of these things are maybe FDA, maybe not. How do people know?
So the FDA has this pretty hilarious, actually, the FDA has a flow chart for everything. They actually have a flow chart entitled How to Know If the FDA is in Your Life in 7 Easy Steps. I'm not making this up. So what they will do is that it's funny, but they walk you through a series of questions that ask you about your idea or your product, and then depending on how you answer that, it'll say, well, your product sounds like a drug. Here's where you would go. Your product sounds like a device. Your product sounds like a biologic. Your product sounds like a combination product, and of course, the focus of my course is on healthcare-related aspects of the FDA, so healthcare industry. So I don't cover tobacco, cosmetics, or food in this course, but this algorithm will include all of those. So that's one way that you can start, and that's at the highest level. If you have some idea where it's going, then I would start diving in at the appropriate center at the FDA where they manage that piece, where you will quickly become swallowed by guidance documents. But that's another whole thing.
So the other thing I would say, if that sounds intimidating, because for some of our clients, they're like, I don't want to start there. The other thing that you can do is if you can identify a product in the market that is similar, then you can Google FDA device classification and whatever that name is, and you will either get something from the FDA itself related to that submission, you'll get something from that company related to what they do, and so that can often be a way to kind of figure out what category should I be looking for, and then go down the path that was just described. So if as you start looking through those questions, you're like, I don't even know what this question means, that can also be a useful tool if you can think of something that's a similar type of product.
Yeah, trying to identify in the device world, those are predicates. Trying to identify those can be challenging, but definitely, I agree. If you already are pretty sure you're not talking about a drug or a biologic, the next step would definitely be to figure out where your competitors are essentially, and if they've gone through the FDA approval process. Not always obvious, and in fact, you will often look for competitors and find that they're not registered with the FDA, and then you think, what does that mean?
Beginning of the conversation.
So but that's a really good place to start. I agree.
Dave, you work with a lot of interesting offbeat products and come up with the path for them. How do you approach it?
So the FDA has I wouldn't say it's a great website. They have a website. It's interesting. You go through the materials, and there's this
much better than it was.
But they've got the legacy website buried behind it
they
now.
do.
It's really crazy.
So if you go through, part of the problem is they have a humongous library of stuff, and some of it is well written, and some of it is not. Some of it's very funny. I think the same guy who did the Bigfoot posts for WSDOT writes some of it. Some of it's really easy to read. And some of it says that it's in English, but I'm not 100% sure. Written by committee. So part of it is you can attempt to do this yourself. There are lots of examples out there. There are things that will try to help you do this. The problem is where a lot of people get tripped up is there's a lot of subtlety to it. What is it exactly you're claiming your product does? What is the intended use? And there's a lot of nuance to whether you are a device, you aren't a device, or maybe you're a wellness device and you're under an exemption or an enforcement discretion. You don't have to deal with the FDA. And so the FDA is great. It's a very much a blunt tool, and it's an okay place to start. But much like the reason I don't file my own taxes, despite the fact I pointed out to my accountant, look, they're just federal regulations. I can figure that out. And then he files my taxes for me because it turns out I can't figure them out. Call a professional. Sometimes it's a quick question, sometimes it's something a little bit more complicated. And part of what I help people do is I say, well, what is it you really want to do with this? What are the people you're trying to treat? What is it you're intending for this thing to be used for? Because sometimes you think when you're forced to sort of lay it out there, I actually make them write it down and email it to me. Because once you've committed to it on paper, it's a little easier to sort of say, this is the way that you're going, or what you're saying makes you this. But if you just didn't do this, or if you did this, suddenly you go from a class 2 to a class 1, or a class 3 to a class 2, or you're now exempt from a particular pathway. So it's a good thing to start and kind of poke around yourself, but I recommend that, especially if it's not 100% clear what you're doing, go ask a professional, because the reality is, much like me trying to file my own taxes, tiny little mistakes will lead you down a wrong road. And the thing that scares me the most is when I get a phone call from somebody who says, so we just talked to the FDA. I go, boop. And I said, and your regulatory person? Oh, we don't have one. I said, that was your first mistake. Please don't talk to the agency. Don't act as your own attorney. Don't act as your own regulatory person. Get a professional to help you do this. So the guidance documents are great. The FDA does have some pretty good tools for this, but they are a little blunt.
And there are a lot of nuances too. So fortunately, you can find people who will have a coffee meeting with you and help you get pointed in the right direction. And one reason I have the first panel in this series of 4 panels for this boot camp was customer discovery and competitors, to kind of get the lay of the land in the space where your products are. But this second panel, I like to have regulatory very early. If you're working in another space like clean tech or technology tools and such, you may not have a panel like this where you cover regulations. And it's so essential in biomedical products, and it can have such a huge impact on your timeline to getting your product to your customers, that it's critically important. And in fact, you may completely change your product strategy or the type of customer that you want to help with the problem, because if you go one direction, it may be a very long, complicated FDA path, which means millions of dollars of funding, and there may be no customer who would pay for the product to make up for that. Whereas if you go another path and try to do something maybe even slightly different, but not with that medical focus, then you may not have nearly as long of a path. So figuring out what path you have is really important.
Yeah, and understanding the stage of development you're in. Because there's a big difference between I'm bouncing around a few ideas, I wonder if this is regulated, and I'm ready to I talk to the FDA and we don't have a regulatory person, right? And so really understanding where you are in that process and going along with customer discovery, making sure that you have some idea where you are, but before you actually put any serious time and investment into the product, that, like Dave said, you're getting that more expert.
Yeah, it's really trying to balance, find this balance between not doing a lot of unnecessary work because you think you know where you are, and thinking, oh, this is easy. We're just a class 1. All we have to do is register and list, and then you get a letter from the FDA saying you have an adulterated product because you thought you were a class 1, but you're not, and you don't want to be on that rail either. So it's a balance, and it totally depends on where you are in the process. I think you can stumble around the FDA. I agree about the website. It's they revamped it 3 years ago, something like that.
They just did it 6 months ago.
They started, and then but they've still got this really old legacy site that sits behind it, and so a lot of the databases that you will access, you will see a completely different look to the page, and that's the old site sitting back there still haunting you.
Can we take a step back for a second and just say, raise your hand if you know what class 1, class 2, and class 3 means, and you have some idea. Okay.
Oh,
thank you. Just helpful to understand.
It's better see my students raise their hand.
Mine aren't here, so that's good.
And so most of the teams are in the prototype phase, and when would you guys advise them to start getting more serious about figuring out what path they're at?
Day 2.
Day 2.
So that's a question.
You thought you were engineers.
When do you get a regulatory person involved? And there's a difference between involved and engaged. So my advice is earlier is always better. And, as was pointed out, most people, most of the consultants I work with, and certainly I'll give you a free hour. Well, not free, you have to buy me coffee, that's my rule. And no cheap coffee, good coffee. But most of us are happy to sit down for a little bit and talk to you about what it is you're trying to do and give you a little bit of well, you might want to go look here, and this is something you might want to consider. And, a lot of these companies, some of them I never hear from again. Some of them will call me back 2 years later and they'll say, okay, we're ready to go. And I'm like, who are you again? What did we talk about 2 years ago? But the earlier, and maybe it's just to cut off huge issues, stop huge mistakes, because you're right, you don't want to go down a road, do a whole bunch of development work that you didn't need to do. You don't want to convince yourself that you're under a certain set of regulations when you're not. And so even if it's just an hour and a half, an early conversation with regulatory is great. And then, like I said, I often just disappear for 6 months because you're off in the lab and you're doing development and you're working on these things, and you don't need me, doing stuff with you because they don't let me touch the expensive equipment anymore. They learned that lesson. But it's the earlier engagement really can give you some early direction. Am I going north or west? That's a little bit of help that early on we can give you.
What I'd add too, in terms of your thinking, a lot of times scientists, engineers can decide about something that they think is important to do. And they don't really know the medicine. They don't know where the medical standards are today. You can read a paper that was written 10 years ago and it's all out of date. And so making sure you understand if there's even a medical need for what you're making is very important up front. So I always make sure that when I'm talking with teams that they've got the right kind of physician with them on their team. They got to make sure they understand what the true problem is, because sometimes you're trying to fix a problem that doesn't really exist anymore. So make sure you've got the right kind of clinician on your team to bounce your ideas off of.
I think that's a great point, and I would add to that increasingly, not only do you need the right kind of clinician, you need the right kind of clinician no matter whether you're planning to market your product to clinicians or to the patients themselves, which is increasingly happening. You still need that clinician that's going to tell you, okay, here's what that means to me in terms of patient care, because that's going to tell you a lot about your product. And the development pathways are different for those in terms of the regulatory pathways. So
Jessica, you might have a few more examples. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something else?
Well, I was just going to add that some products are very cut and dry of if they're a medical device or if they're not, and if they need to be regulated. There's other products that kind of fall in that middle space of, are they a wellness product? Are they being marketed to a consumer? Or are they actually a medical device? And those are the ones that can be tricky and can also just depend on how you market the device. Sometimes it could be the exact same device, but it depends on what you want to claim, and whether it's going to be a medical regulated device or if it can just be a consumer wellness device. So those are some of the nuances that Dave and Cindy were talking about. Another thing to think about is you do need to know if you're a medical device kind of early on in the project or in development, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be under design controls, which we can talk about a little bit more later. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it changes anything. It's just good to be aware of that so that you know then who your patient is or who you're selling the product to, because you want to get that feedback and make sure that this is a product, just like what Lynn was talking about.
So can someone do a brief overview, though, of the different classes of medical devices? So that we...
Just to confuse everybody, the FDA regulates drugs all as one class. There is no classification striation in drugs. Devices, however, are classified by risk, essentially. Class 1 devices are the lowest risk devices, and generally,
give me an example.
Tongue depressors. Seriously, they're medical devices. Band-Aids, and thermometers, and so think of kind of legacy devices that have been around for a long time, and that are low risk. So those typically, if you and I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but the FDA actually has an incredibly long series of regulations called device classification panels, where they have identified each and every type of device according to them, under medical specialties, so anesthesia, neurology, et cetera. And there is an individual regulation describing each type of device. And if you can figure out which one is yours, which is tricky, what that will tell you is what class it's in. Generally speaking, Class 1 devices are exempt from almost all of FDA's regulations. That means you don't have to go through an approval process. You don't need to follow, sometimes you don't even need to follow what they call general controls. All you have to do is register with the FDA and list your product. But there are exceptions. So, Class 2 in the middle, we've heard people talk about 510Ks. Those are Class 2 devices, generally speaking. You have to do everything in the succeeding classes that you have to do in the lowest class, and then they add stuff. So for Class 2, you have to register and list. You most of the time still have to seek this 510K clearance letter, which means you have to show the FDA that your product is substantially equivalent to a predicate product on the market. There are all kinds of nuances around that. Some Class 2 devices are exempt from 510Ks, and then you have to comply with all of the controls that apply to Class 1 and a few others. Class 3 is the highest risk device, and that looks like a drug approval process. It's called a pre-market approval, and it's the full level of hoop jumping, clinical trials, and it takes a longer time. And in addition to that, you have to comply with all of the conditions that Class 1 and Class 2 devices comply with. So that's like the 500,000-foot view.
When it comes to Class 3, you're typically talking implantables or
Yeah,
life-saving
they're usually implantables, life-supporting or life-sustaining devices, or devices that otherwise pose a serious risk to the patient or treat a serious illness. Those are kind of the large buckets that they're in. There's this oddball way to land in Class 3, which is if you're a Class 2 with no predicate, you get technically classified as a Class 3, but there's a process you can go through because your device is actually low risk. There's just nothing like it on the market. You end up back in Class 2, but technically So if you go through the whole process as a Class 3 device, those are usually life support, life-sustaining, implantables, right, for obvious reasons.
And just be aware, if you're thinking about marketing your product in Europe, they've subdivided it. So they have more than us.
Yeah.
They have 1A and 1B and 2A and 2B. And so there's...
They have
MDRs.
MDRs.
It's not a good time.
Yeah.
There's like a year waiting list.
It's just a little different. Same concept, though, of escalating risk.
They use a lot of the same standards, but the processes are different, and the way that they carve up the buckets is different in the EU. And then we won't even talk about Australia.
So we have some teams
nice
that
clean
have software components in their, we have some teams who have software components in their devices. They may not be medical devices, or they may be. So Jessica, you're a good one to.
Yeah, so software is classified slightly differently. Oh, we're talking about software now.
Oh, software.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
So we're arguing about Australia.
Yeah, we're arguing about Australia.
We'll leave Australia.
Yeah.
They have other problems right now.
Yeah, they do.
Jessica.
Yeah, so software has its own classification. I haven't done that in a while, so I don't remember what they are, but it's like
mean
low,
the-
medium, and high.
Yeah, it's
Risk.
the
Just can't remember what they're called.
They're actually
Level of
yeah,
concern, thank you.
Right. And they actually still technically fall into the same buckets, but
Yeah, they do, but then
yeah,
the software can
but
be
then
treated
they-
separately.
yeah.
But if you're a software as a medical device, then that's your classification. And
And if you have both software and hardware, you're just going into the same
Right.
classification,
And then there are types of software that were actually accepted from the definition of medical device by the 21st Century Cures Act. So there's some software that doesn't qualify as a medical device, and the FDA can no longer regulate that. Now, the FDA disagrees on some of those interpretations of that because the Cures Act is statutory, which means it doesn't provide you with a whole ton of detail. So that's been a developing area of controversy and confusion because it's not super well settled. It's better than it was a couple
couple years ago.
But you can see how hard it is for us to answer this in a concise way, just all the nuances that go along with classification. That's why you need to talk to a regulatory person.
Yeah, that's the bottom
Just
line.
because you're software only doesn't mean you're not a medical device.
Correct.
Yes.
You probably still are, and you need to talk to somebody and figure it out.
Yep.
And if not, then great, good news, but
Yep.
don't assume you're not just
Right,
because you're
right,
software
right.
only.
So the bottom line for all you medical device or software folks or equipment for hospitals, we'll capture some of these people after this talk and talk to them. So let's move on to product development. So a researcher or engineer can cobble together some things in their garage. And if you listen to the founding of some of our medical device companies back in the day, these guys actually did cobble together medical devices in their garage. But now that's not really how it's done, and there are a lot more procedures around that. Can someone talk to us about how they tackle product design when we have a prototype, maybe in a research lab, and it's ready to move on? What does that entail?
Yeah, so I think it's important to clarify between a technology prototype and a product prototype. So there's a difference between proving that a technology can do what you want it to do and starting to actually put together a product you would take to market. And so it's important to distinguish between that, because your approach to what you're doing and how far along you are in the product development process is going to be drastically different. So if you think about when we first figured out that ultrasound waves could produce an image, it was still 60 years before we actually had ultrasounds in a hospital the way we do now, right? So a lot of what you're going to see and what we're talking about is really product development. It's not necessarily novel technologies. And so if you're at the phase where you're truly developing a novel technology, just know that that product development process is likely a much longer process.
And why?
Well, so when we talk about taking a product to market, what we're really talking about is, can you consistently deliver the same result? And in some cases, that is tremendously, exponentially harder to do than deliver that result once. And so at the technology level, we're saying, is this possible? And at the product level, we're saying, is this possible, repeatable, and safe every single time it's done for whatever the life of that product is? And so you're talking about the shelf life, you're talking about the useful life, you're talking about the number of uses. There's all different ways that we can define that, but there's a difference between being able to prove something is possible and being able to have that same experience.
Yeah, it's really important to draw that line about what is considered technology development and what is considered product development, because that's when Dave says that people come to him and then disappear for 6 months or 2 years, it's because they're off doing that technology development. And that's when you're iterating on your technology and doing your proof of concept prototypes and going off and talking to customers and trying to figure out what your product really is. And then once you are ready to write a product requirements document and you're ready to kind of draw that line in the sand, that's when you want to go into design controls. Because design controls is when you have to start really documenting everything, and that's when you really start being regulated from a FDA perspective. And so everything just becomes a lot more onerous from that point forward. So you want to be able to act freely and quickly while you're doing technology development, and then once you get into product development, it's kind of just gets much more process oriented, and the documentation requirements become much more stringent. And it's just much more expensive to do changes at that point the further along you get.
So along those same lines, if you have product requirements, it's fine in that early phase to have TBD as part of your requirement. But once you actually have defined that, now you have to justify why you're changing it. So one thing we see people do a lot is they try and hurry up, and I know I'm supposed to have product requirements and user needs, I'm supposed to have all this stuff, so I'm just going to get it all out there. And they've basically picked a lot of arbitrary starting points. And that's fine if you're doing technology development. You've got to start somewhere to say, okay, what are we going to evaluate, right? But when you're saying this is the product we're building, then you have to be able to explain why you're changing that requirement. So really making sure you understand the way your technology works, what your users need, how you expect this product to behave within the ecosystem it's going to be in, before you go under those design controls and the more formal product development process is really going to save you a lot of heartache. The other thing to consider is that it's not an all or nothing kind of thing. So different companies handle this differently, but we typically see what we call engineering controls and then DV, design verification controls. We see people who look at prototyping and engineering verification. There's all different ways you can define it, but basically there's a difference between doing configuration management, which is just I know what version of the product I had at what point, and having full design controls where I'm actually going through a rigorous process in terms of whether or not I can develop and change the design.
I was just going to add that the FDA has an early feasibility program where I'm actually helping a team go through that now with a device because they need to test the prototype on injured people. And so they have to do a clinical study with this prototype device that would require quite a bit of work in terms of getting approval to do a clinical study. So the FDA does have a program that aims at simplifying it a bit, that you have a much lower bar for the application to do a clinical study, and you're basically doing iterations on your prototypes during that phase before you get to final design controls.
And that brings up a good question. So if people have a medical device that does need to have some clinical study, either for approval to get payment for it or for the FDA, how far along do they need to be with their device before they can do their clinical study? And if they've done a study with one version of device, can they change it at any point? Or is...
It depends.
That was a can of worms question, wasn't it?
I got 90 hours worth of material on this question. So when do you? So I mean, there's lots of questions. First is whether you have to go to the FDA at all to do a clinical study on a medical device. There's exemptions from going to the FDA. There's non-significant risk classifications that can get you out of the FDA. So we should move away from when do you have to go to the FDA to when you do a formal study, I guess is really what the issue is. So when are you ready to do a formal study? I get asked that question a lot. So there's no like solid line in the sand where this is okay and this is not. Some of the products I've worked on have gone out as fairly early prototypes. Some of them have gone out probably long after they should have because they spent way too much time in the design process, so we can test some things early on. So what they're really looking for before they're going to let you touch a human with your product is it relatively safe? Every medical device that you use has some kind of impact on the human body. Nothing scares me more than when I hear somebody say, my product has absolutely no side effects. Because what that means is that your product has absolutely zero impact on the body.
Or you don't know what your side effects
Or you don't know what your side effects are. Or you're not looking in the right place for side effects.
Sample size is 3.
Yeah.
You've been testing it for 5 weeks. Yeah.
So the issue is that you have to have some basic safety in place. You have to know, for example, it's not going to explode. It's not going to shock anybody. The materials, you haven't made your entire product out of like latex and people are going to have allergic reactions to it. So there's some internal sort of controls that you have to put into place. It's an internal checklist. If you go all the way to the FDA, they will look at what you've done to make sure that you're really ready to go into people. Usually they expect to see some non-clinical data. I had a lovely conversation earlier today where somebody kept saying, we don't have non-clinical data, all we have is cadaver data. And I said, cadaver is non-clinical. But it's this idea, you have to have tested this at some point. You have to have a reason for the FDA or the Institutional Review Board to believe that you're not going to harm people. But what you don't have to have is a completely tested, validated piece of equipment. And so there's not a single simple answer. Every company's product is a little bit different. You use our kind of wussy regulatory answer, which is it depends. But there's a minimum line you should have crossed, which is you're probably not going to harm anybody with what you do. You also need to make sure that your device is going to do what you think it's going to do. Otherwise, you're just wasting people's time. You're wasting your money, and you're wasting people who volunteered to participate in your study. On the other hand, can you change it once you start? I would expect that you would. Nobody designs anything perfectly from the get-go. If your product never changes from initial prototype to final version, you're either a 1 in a billion lottery winner or you're just not paying attention to your data. The FDA looks at this design history. They expect you to have made changes. You're going to do a test, you're going to go, oh, this didn't work right. It doesn't turn on when it's supposed to, or it gets too hot. I had a device that we thought was great until we took it to the clinic, and it turned out it was so light that when you pulled the cord, it flew off the desk and smashed on the ground. It wasn't a problem with the equipment as long as we could keep it on the desk. It was that it was poorly designed that way. Our initial fix, by the way, was duct tape and not to redesign the device. But they expect to see a transition. So the real question is, can you change it in the middle of a study? not without amending your study, because you have to tell the IRB and the FDA that we've changed the device.
What's an IRB?
It's an ethics committee. Anytime you touch a human subject, you have to get permission from an ethics, not every single time, but most of the time when you're going to use well, there's very few exceptions these days, but that's for another discussion. So most of the
stands for
Institutional Review Board.
And so it's actually a board from the hospital or the university or whatever the institution is that you would be working with.
Unless it's an independent. So, but it's a board, whoever it happens to be, that basically looks at human subjects and makes sure that it's safe. So you have to tell them that you've changed the device. Changing the device between rounds of the study is also anticipated. The real question is, if you've changed the device, is the previous data of any value? Depends how much you change the device. The FDA expects there to be changes between prototypes. And when you go to the end of the FDA and you say, this is all the data we have, you have to explain to the FDA why, despite the fact you changed this device between stages, the data is still valid. Maybe all you did was change the color. Maybe all you did was make the device heavier so you don't drag it off the desk. But if you change the power levels, if you change the dosing levels, if you change the way the power goes into the body or how it touches the human, then the data is probably not as relevant as it was, because the truth is it's not the same device that it was. So basically that's the long answer for it depends.
Yeah, and to keep in mind here when we talk about studies is clinical studies are not the only formal studies.
Correct.
So when it comes to formative and summative studies, so this would be another category which is really looking at the human factors. So if you have a surgeon who's using this device, can it be used by a full range of surgeons? And so we often would talk about the 5% female to the 95% male, which is basically a very small hand to a very big hand. Can they all still hold this device? Or you look at a device we're working on that was head-worn. And so, people have different shapes of foreheads and they have different ways that they move. And so when you're doing that formative study, you may not even have the actual product, right? So we had one software where they were literally holding up pieces of paper and saying, what would you do if you saw this on the screen? So there's definitely different levels that depending on what your device is and depending on where your areas of concern are. And so that's why risk analysis is such a big part of what ties all this together, is to understand where there's risk in your product and how you can start to address that. And then the summative study should really be the product you're taking on market. That's all the way towards the end of the process to say, okay, let's confirm that what we actually ended up with accomplishes what we intended it to. But so there's different types of studies, even formal studies, that are not just the clinical.
And you may or may not need what the FDA considers the gold standard of clinical trials, depending on what risk level your device is. So, that's another factor to think about. If you do trip the wire, and you heard Dave talk about non-significant risk, the flip of that is and this is a determination that's made by your IRB, if your study's significant risk, then you need an investigational device exemption. If you need an investigational device exemption, then you get to actually send all this information into the FDA as you're doing your study. They still say that they're not always going to require the gold standard randomized controlled clinical trial, which is much more difficult in devices than it is in drugs. But you will have a lot of the data that Dave was describing you'd actually be required to report that to the FDA in regular summaries, and they would expect you to be addressing and adjusting your protocol as you need to, and of course the device as you're going along. And then, and before you get there, they expect you to have gathered this preclinical data. So, and some of it you need to gather, even if you're going for a class 2 510K submission, you still need to gather data that shows that your device is substantially equivalent to the predicate. And so what they're looking for there is it safe? Does it blow up? And does it perform in a substantially equivalent manner to the predicate, which presumably does not blow up? And also, is it the same intended use? Those are the things that you have to demonstrate to the FDA. So it's a really wide spectrum, and some of it is informed by the risk classification of your device. A lot of it, at least telling you how deeply you're going to be involved with the FDA during the research phases, particularly the human subjects research phases.
And like we mentioned before at the previous panel, even though you may not need to do studies for the FDA for your device, you may need to do studies in order to get the get insurance to agree to reimburse, or CMS to agree
that's
to
a whole
reimburse.
other
And
level of
you may also need those studies to convince physicians or even patients that it's worth using the product. So that's a different kind of study. But I did want to touch briefly on therapeutics. We don't have a lot of therapeutic teams in this room, but we may have some coming forth in the future. And we do have a team that's working on therapeutic type products. So Lynn, can you give like a short version of what are the steps? If someone has a new biotech or a new small molecule, what would be the steps?
Well, drug product development, like device development, is all about safety and efficacy. And there's different steps in terms of determining whether a new drug is safe and efficacious. And there's typically a suite of clinical trials that are done from small to big to get that information. In order to run a clinical trial with an investigational drug, there's a gate that you go through called an investigational new drug application, or IND. And an IND, like a device exemption, is a compilation of all the data you have about that product that is intended to show that it's safe, should be safe, doesn't say it's efficacious. It may have some information about efficacy in animal models, but primarily safety. And that means that prior to submitting an IND, you've done quite a bit of information, quite a bit of work to show that it's safe in animals, that you can make this product reproducibly, that you've manufactured product according to manufacturing standards, and that you have a reasonable understanding of what this product is and how it will interact with a living body. So the IND is a major document. I think in my class I say that the first one I ever did was several thousand pages long, and it includes the results of all the animal studies, all the bench testing, all the synthesis data, everything you've done to come up with this product and show that it's safe. And so once you file an IND, you're going through a long period of time that can be very short if it turns out not to be safe, or years long if it's safe and you're going through a set of studies to figure out exactly if it works or not. And that's one of the challenges with drugs, is that it's very difficult for many drugs to understand what the measure is that you should use to show that it works. Every disease you can think of, let's just take a tumor, for instance. It could be that the tumor goes away. It could be that the tumor gets smaller. It could be just that you live longer. It could be that you feel better. There's all kinds of different measures, what we call outcome measures, that are difficult to pinpoint sometimes in certain diseases. And that's why clinical research can be so long, is that companies think they know how they're going to show efficacy, but then they do a study and it doesn't show it. It doesn't show any difference between the new drug and the standard of care that you're comparing it to. So it can be a long, years-long process. At the end of this, you will do 2 identical phase 3 studies, in most cases with a representative population, depending on how many people in the country have the disease. So for orphan diseases, which affect less than 200,000 people in the country, phase 3 clinical trials can be fairly small, 200 to 300 people in them, whereas cardiology studies that affect thousands and millions of people in the United States can be 4,000 to 10,000 people in them. So huge range in terms of how complicated those clinical studies are. At the end of all that, you've also been continuing on with your animal safety studies. You've also been continuing on in fine-tuning the manufacturing process and scaling up the manufacturing process so that it meets the presumed demand for that product. So a tremendous amount of work that all gets assembled into either a new drug application or a biologics license application, depending on what type of drug it is. The one that I did was 87,000 pages. It's a tremendous amount of
Truckloads,
data.
they say.
7,000? Was it small font?
Yeah, we had a big truck. We had to go down to North Carolina where it was being printed because we didn't have electronic submissions then, and put it in a truck and go to Washington, D.C. and back up to Bethesda and dump this thing off. So
This is why people love 510K.
yes. So at the end of that, the FDA goes through a period of review, which can be 6 months to 2 years, depending on how important that drug is, and make a decision on whether to approve it or not. There's a lot of communication with the FDA all along. Things change. The closer you get to the end, there's all new things in terms of marketing and advertising and safety, follow-on studies. It just never ends.
Yes. Don't you love these people?
Plus the.
So what kinds of costs will there be then? with
Well,
both?
the pharma industry has done studies. They now say it costs $2.6 billion to bring a new drug to market, but that's kind of a fake number. It's calculated based on the failures. You heard that there are a lot of failures, like 90% failures, and so when one of those failures could have started right at the beginning, or it could have gotten all the way to phase 3 before it failed. So the amount of money that's pouring into the failures really augments the actual cost. But if you had nothing go wrong and it made it through, it could do it in a, $50 to $100 million, depending on what the indication is and how many people you're studying.
What about devices? Oh, sorry.
12 bucks.
What, $12?
No.
Yeah.
So one of the primary factors on the device side is how much of the expertise you have within your team and how much of it you're outsourcing. So typically when you are outsourcing a majority of your product development costs, you're generally going to fall somewhere in the 2 to 10 million kind of range. If you're doing it all in-house, then it depends on whether or not you need any clinical trials. It depends on what types of experts you're bringing in. I mean, even things as much as like, are you building a $10 product or a $100,000 product? Every prototype you build, typically we see early prototypes costing about 10 times what the final product is going to cost. So there's going to be a huge variability within your budget, in part based on what type of device you're building. But
Well,
we'll see.
So there's just a lot of variation. I mean, drugs are all one class. Devices are 3 classes. 1 is cheaper than 3, 2 is cheaper than 3. How many clinicals do you have to go through? How many prototype runs? How many different conformance standards do you have? Are you just biocompatibility? Is electromagnetic interference? Again, how much of it do you have to outsource? How much of it can you do internally? How expensive is your indication? If you're doing acne in a clinical study, or are you doing prostate cancer in a clinical study? It's all, whatever it is, it's cheaper than a drug by factors of 10 and 100.
Yeah.
I thought 2.7 was kind of a generous number for this. The last statistic I saw was the average phase 3 clinical study patient is $17,000 per patient. Yeah. So a study of 8,000 patients is like $126 million, $136 million. So it really, devices are cheaper, and it's because sometimes they don't do clinicals, the testing is less, the time period is shorter. To be honest, I get questions like, well, how much is the FDA going to charge to submit this? Believe me, if that's the part you're worrying about, you're focusing on the wrong. It's $10,000 to do a 510K. Unless you're a small business, then it's $2,000 or $3,000. But you're going to spend way more than that on all the development, the testing, the prototyping, the manufacturing setup, the clinical studies, the usability studies that you talked about.
All the reports that go into that.
The reports that go into that. And so that's, the fees are nothing. But whatever it is, I've never seen a device cost more than a drug, except for a drug-device combination. But that's really, that was the drug's fault and not the device's fault.
Yeah, and then the device is such a small piece of it, you don't even, it's like in the noise.
Sometimes it's kind of nice being a device in a combination because they're like, yeah, whatever, just get it done.
You need to talk to Lynn. That's not my problem.
So let's end by having each of you say, can you think of an exciting device or therapeutic that's recently come onto the market that either you've worked on or that you just noted as being interesting?
Well, I had the good fortune to work for several years with the Cystic Fibrosis Organization, both nationally and here in Seattle. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with cystic fibrosis, but when I was a kid, most kids my age, 12, 13 years old, didn't live much past that. And it's been a gradual improvement in different areas to get them to maybe live till they were 40. That was really something. So one of the things in cystic fibrosis is that it's caused by one gene, one of those unusual diseases. There's many mutations that can occur in that gene, but basically it's a question of salt getting in and out of cells. That was the basic defect in the gene. And so I worked with companies that started to look at making a small molecule that could open up the pore on the cell surface to let salt in and out and to try to equalize that. And it was complicated because some CF patients had one mutation and others had a different, and so it wasn't very easy. So when I started in CF, one of the things that I worked with a company that developed a drug that could open the salt pore of a very small subset of CF patients, about 10% of them. And I can't tell you, I don't know if you know how in the old days CF patients were diagnosed by licking their skin because it was very salty because of this salt imbalance. So we developed a test to measure how much salt was in the sweat. It was this little device that you'd put on the hand and it would sweat. And it got a filter paper. And that first study, when the salt concentration went to normal, we just all fell on the floor. It was so exciting. But it was only 10% of the population. And that company, which is Vertex in Boston, has continued to put effort into the disease. And this year, actually it was the end of 2019, they got approved the final drug in the series that treats 90% of CF patients. Wow. And it's going to change CF forever into a disease that people can live with a long time. And it's very, very exciting to have been part of that process going through. It's going to cost a lot.
Oh, yes.
But it worked.
I guess I'll go next. I don't have a great story like Lynn does.
Can't top that.
Yeah, we start
You
with
go
that
last
one.
next time.
For me, it's more of a kind of a classification of devices. I'm really excited by seeing a lot of the devices that have historically been used in hospitals available in the home. So it's kind of just that consumerization of healthcare that we're seeing now that I think is exciting for diabetes patients, for COPD patients, just dialysis, like all kinds of stuff is starting to be available in the home, and I think it's really fun to see that and be a part of that.
I mean, again, for me, it's I don't have a great story. Seriously, Lynn, next time, man,
Yeah.
you're going fast. The big thing I'm seeing has been nanoparticles. Early on, sorry, I stole yours. I apologize. I could hear you think. I could hear you thinking.
I'll just second that, yeah.
So for a long time, nanoparticles were about transporting drugs to places, which was great, but the nanoparticle basically is just, it's not interesting. Now the actual use of the nanoparticles in the therapy, they're being heated, they're being radiated, they're being electrified, and they're so good at targeting and treating little tiny areas. One of the problems in cancer has been you don't go after cancer, with a scalpel, you go after cancer with a shotgun. And it causes a lot of damage, whether it's radiation or chemotherapy. And, you've all probably had a family member who's been through this, and it's not a pleasant experience. And so this ability to use these nanoparticles in dozens of different types of cancers is allowing us to focus in, because people are living past the cancer, and it's about that long-term quality of life. I mean, prostate cancer is the one we always use as an example. The cure rate is quite high if it's a certain stage of prostate cancer, if you get it later in life. But guys who have it, guys who get treated, live another 15, 18, 20 years, and if the side effects of your therapy are awful, you're living 15, 18, 20 years with that complication. So now sort of focusing that therapy down and seeing it in the nanoparticles has been great, because they're living fairly normal lives for the next 20 years. They end up like my father, yelling at the news.
Healthy, yelling at the
Healthy and yelling at the news.
Yeah, I
I second that. I'm really excited about what's going on in nanotechnology. And there's a lot. I mean, it feels like there are so many trials sitting there just teetering on the brink of, the major breakthrough. There's one that I've been watching for about 5 years now down in LA that, and he started off doing pancreatic cancer work. And now they're doing all kinds of cancer work, including breast cancer, lung cancer. But that's exactly the concept is, there are so many things we can do, targeted T cells, and everything's a nanoparticle. And so the idea is let's just, they're called killer T cells. And they only go after the tumor, and the tumor likes sugar. So there are all kinds of things that are happening in that space, but it makes radiation oncology look like, I don't know, witchcraft.
Caveman.
Yeah. So yeah, I would watch the nanotechnology space. It's just fascinating.
On a personal level, I would completely agree with that. That's not something I've had a chance to work on, but completely agree with that. So I would say some of the things I'm the most excited about right now are not on market yet, so I can't talk about those, but kind of surgical visualization, diabetes care, there's some cool stuff going on. But one thing, just kind of taking the question a little bit different way, about once every year or two, I talk to someone who is still using a device that a lot of people here in the Seattle area developed about a decade ago, and my business partner is one of those. And it's still considered best in class. It's still the preferred technology. And just yesterday, it showed up on like the Cheddar, LinkedIn, whatever, as this like novel new device. And I'm like, that actually came out in 2008. But hundreds of thousands of posts within the first 24 hours about how amazing this is and where can I get this and all of that. And it's a atherectomy device for clearing peripheral arterial disease. And Biomedical Technologies is a company that a lot of people that you'll meet, it grew to about 200 before it was acquired. So there's a lot of Seattle area people. And it's just a real encouragement to me that the things that we're doing, not only do they matter for patients now, but when they're done well, when they're solving a real problem, they can still be solving that problem a decade later. And so it's just a real encouragement and reminder to do things with excellence and to solve real problems, and to not just look for that way to quickly get, an acquisition or a IPO or whatever, but to really look at part of what the opportunity we have to do within Biomed is to solve some of the world's biggest challenges.
Thank
I
you.
would ditto that. I think the main thing of all of this is go for the medical need. There's nothing like solving a medical problem. It's so gratifying compared to a Me Too. That's not very gratifying.
Okay, well, I guess we don't have too much time for questions, but maybe a couple. Do you guys have questions? In the back.
Your product integrates multiple pieces that have all been approved in different contexts. Does that change your path to the approval of the integrated device?
Yeah, let me restate the question so that it comes across. If the product uses different components or different pieces that are approved separately, but you're putting them together, you're integrating them, then what does that mean for your path?
It depends. So the FDA, it depends on kind of what your product is, but the FDA regulates. I'm not quite sure how to put this, but they regulate the product, and they don't particularly care to individually approve components at a certain level, if that makes sense. So it depends on what those components are. If each component is approved as a medical device, then your problem is going to be that your product is likely not going. You can't say we're substantially equivalent to all of these. It's just not going to work. So then, depending on how risky your product is, you're likely to end up in a bucket called de novo reclassification, which is where you can't find a predicate, but your device should be class 2 in risk. And what they do is they have you go through a slightly higher level of hoop jumping, but you're not at at the Class 3 pre-market approval levels. So it does depend.
Yeah, so we had a situation with a client on this recently, and it depends on the type of product you're developing, but an option to avoid that kind of scenario is they actually got the original submission for one portion that basically combines two things where they could show a predicate and do a 510K. And then after that, you can use yourself as the predicate to add on that next feature and that next feature and the next feature and build it out. And you don't necessarily have to go to market with the first thing you get a clearance on. So you can get a 510K clearance and keep going. And it makes it a lot easier when you're doing trials and things like that. You have a cleared product, but you don't necessarily have to take that to market. You can build on it. So that's part of where the advice has been talk to a regulatory expert, because there are different ways to do it. But we've found previously that clients have been able to find a way to still get that shorter 510K path. They just have to be a little more creative about how they approach the product development process.
The other thing is, so there's a lot of tools out there that the FDA has categories for. They're not about doing something themselves. They're about connecting two things, telephonically, electronically, projecting pictures, transmitting communication between particular devices that have their own classification. The nice thing about that is if you're only selling the tool that connects other things together, then that particular product actually has a very low bar with the FDA, because all you have to show is you take this thing and this thing and this thing and bring all three of them together without impacting how any of them work. It's, that's a low risk product. So you're right. I mean, is it a system? You're 510K'ing after each one? Is it something that's combining a whole bunch of individual elements together? Or are you simply connecting in some creative way technologies that are already on the market and you're just making them work together? In that case, like I said, the FDA has these little weird categories scattered throughout the regulations for communications tools, for remote control tools that are extremely low risk, because that portion of it itself isn't a risky technology.
Class 1.
They're all pretty much.
Or an accessory.
Or an accessory or something like that,
It just depends on what the specific case
So
is.
talk to a regulatory person.
And with that, let's thank our panel, and then you can go capture these guys before they leave.